Welcome to Cultimatum, the podcast that delves deep into the culture of complexities of cults and human trafficking. I'm your host, Anonymous Andrew. Each week, we explore different facets of cult life and human trafficking, from the psychological manipulation to the brave stories of those who have escaped.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melody. I'm Andrew's co-host. Having experienced the depth of a cult firsthand, specifically the House of Yahweh, I'm here as an advocate for fellow survivors. My journey has inspired me to help others who find themselves in similar situations. This podcast is committed to respecting our guests' privacy. To ensure their comfort and safety, we offer them the option to remain anonymous.
Additionally, we would like to include a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Cultimatum or its affiliates. Cultimatum is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information shared by our hosts and guests. The content discussed on this podcast is based on personal experiences, opinions, and speculation, and should not be construed as professional services or advice. Neither the host nor the guest are assuming liability for any misuse or reliance on the information presented. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and listeners are encouraged to conduct their own research and seek professional advice where appropriate.
Before we dive into today's episode, we want to issue a trigger warning. Some episodes may explore explicit and potentially disturbing topics such as sexual abuse, rape, human trafficking, suicide, and other sensitive subjects. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Cultimatum, the culture of cults and human trafficking. My name is Anonymous Andrew, and with me today is Melody. Hello, Melody.
Hi, Andrew. We have a unique guest with us today. We have Kim Peirano, and she is the ex-member of a cult called the Foundation for Spiritual Development. She is also a doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine and a hypnotherapist. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Kim, I'm going to tell the audience a little bit about how I found you. So, Kim and I are part of a Podmatch, which is a community of podcasters and guests. And so we got introduced there. But that's with the Anonymous Andrew podcast. But Kim happened to have experience or has been in a cult. So I asked her to come over to Cultimatum and share her story here. And then, of course, we're going to have her on the Anonymous Andrew podcast because she's got another whole story for that. So, Kim, where would you like to start? Tell us a little bit about, I guess, your cult experience.
Yeah. Where to start? There's so many ways to go about that. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about the group in the first place. So I'm in the Bay Area in California, and there's a lot of interesting, we have a lot of openness to new and different things. And there's a few like psychic schools around. I actually went to one when I was younger, and then kind of came across this one through a colleague that I worked with, and took me a few years to finally show up to a class, and then finally did, and was totally enamored with it because it was very similar to the school I had gone to before. I was at a place in my life where I was like, oh, nothing's really working the way I want it to. How can I change everything? And found this group. They function kind of like a school where you take a class every week and then you move up in different levels. And it's sort of once you get to the upper levels where things get really kind of funky, and eventually discovered why and left. And now we're talking about it.
Could you be more specific about funky?
Absolutely. So when you go to this school, the first couple levels you're learning like what they call psychic tools. And it's like grounding and a meditation called running your energy, which is probably lots of people are pretty familiar with. Like it's not anything really new. You learn about chakras. They have a whole lesson one of the days in the first level about why the school is not a cult, which is definitely a red flag as to somebody being.
Oh, when they say it up front, you're right. It's a red flag.
Disclaimer about how you're not a cult. That usually means you are. And the preface in that lesson was always like, you're free to leave at any time. They don't, you're not charged like a big amount of money up front. You can just walk away at any time. But what's free to leave at any time, like that's sort of the definition of a jail, right? Like you're not free to leave a jail at any time. When you're in a cult or a coercive control type group, like you're free to leave at any time, but there's an exit cost to leaving.
Consequences, yeah.
And what you lose or the fears that they implant to you, like about what might happen if you do leave. So you kind of move through the first 3 levels, and then you go into level 4, which is kind of indefinite for some people. There's people who are in level 4 and they've been there for 10, 15 years. And then eventually you might get asked to go to level 5. And nobody talks about level 5. One of the agreements and rules of the group is that if you're in an upper level, you're not allowed to talk about what you're doing with the lower level students, which is also kind of typical cult-like group, right? We have this special information and then you can't talk about it to anybody else because you'll put them at effect or you'll trigger them or they'll go crazy and die, was kind of the messaging around that. And so nobody really knows what happens in level 5. And so I moved through the first 4 levels like seamlessly. And then eventually a group kind of gelled out of that group that got called to do Senate readings to go to this elusive level 5. A Senate reading is like a psychic reading with 20 people, like 20 people reading you. So instead of a one-on-one, it's you sitting in a hot seat and 20 people who are all in these upper levels giving you a reading, which is very, very intense and kind of terrifying.
And uncomfortable, I would imagine.
Totally.
Yeah.
And at this point, like, I'm in the headspace, like, this school is changing my whole life. And a lot of things really did change in that first kind of year I was there, where you're kind of learning all cults kind of start with something that's usually pretty helpful. And so things were changing, things were getting better. I was like, this is totally the answer to all of my problems. The leader of the school, I had a reading with, like a private session with, maybe in level 4 or 3. And he told me that I needed to get my shit together or I would create myself a heart attack or cancer by the time I was 35, which was basically like, if you don't stay here and do all of this stuff, like this bad thing's going to happen to you. And that totally made sense to me at the time. I was like, that tracks. Okay, if my shit is not together, like how can we put it back together? So I was very committed to the pot at that point in time. We got notice like months later that you got accepted into level 5, and then that's where the fun kind of starts.
Question.
Yeah.
How old were you at this point?
Let me do some math here. I was like 29, 30-ish.
Okay.
Yeah. So
you had already gone to college.
I had already gone to college, gone to acupuncture school. I had an acupuncture practice that was really struggling. I was kind of splitting my time between an acupuncture practice and like DJing and producing nightlife events and raves, which was super fun, but not super stable either. And that was kind of where I was at.
And the doctor of Chinese medicine, where did that come in?
That's what I did after my undergrad. So I did an undergrad and then like worked for like a year at an insurance place and then decided I was going to go to acupuncture school and then did that.
So most of your credentials were prior to joining this New Age cult?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just curious, did you ever go to the Orient, to the China or Eastern medicine? No. Okay.
No, I've never made it.
All right. So this leader sits you down and says, get your shit together or you're going to have cancer or a heart attack or something. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Melody, you have a question?
I did have a question. When you said that there were consequences for leaving, was that like the consequence was the cancer and that kind of stuff? Is that the kind of consequences that were threatened if you leave?
In essence, yeah. We're like around the time I was like starting to leave, I was talking about this a lot with a lot of the people who were in my class. And that was like a common thread where we were all kind of like aware of the fact that we were in a cult, but had the idea that it was sort of working out. But there's a lot of stories that get told, like about people who leave and then their house burns down, or they left and then they got cancer and they left, and all of these like really negative things happen. So there's a lot of fear around leaving, which gets sort of built in different ways, like the stories of people who left that had bad things happen. Then there's also like one of the ways that this group really makes you feel special and like makes you want to stay there is by like what I call love bombing, like because love bombing makes you feel really special. This school's like emotionally very stark. Like nobody hugs each other. There's not a lot of like fraternization where people are talking and hanging out, but you're told when you show up on that first day that this school has this like very unique, special information that he calls fast path information. Like it's a fast path school of fast path to growth, which is like wanting to know everything instead of just like be at peace or something. And that you wouldn't have even shown up and walked through that door unless you were a fast path person. And since you're a fast path person, you have to do only fast path spiritual growth work in order to grow. And you're welcome to find that somewhere else, but we've never seen it anywhere else. Right. So they're like creating this monopoly of how you would approach your spiritual growth, thinking that, oh, if I leave. So what happens in the upper levels is if you leave in the middle, you're not allowed to come back until another level like comes to the same place. So if I left in the middle of level 5, I can't just come back and hop in. You have to wait until a level 5 starts and then you can start. And there's always this like scarcity mindset around that because they're not like on a timeline. There's like the leader, Dana, he's the only person who is quote unquote allowed to teach level 5. So if he's not doing it, nobody else is, nobody else can. And he's always threatening everyone in a not like a threatening way, but he's always talking about how his death contract is up and he's not really supposed to be here anymore. He's on borrowed time. So he could just keel over at any moment. So if you don't stay, like there might never be an opportunity to come back. So among the costs of like the fear of something bad happening to you is also the fear of like never being able to spiritually grow again, or the fear that like this was the thing you were supposed to do and now you left and you can't come back.
Were there any? I'm looking for. I think you're our first New Age cult. Most of the cults that we have interviewed have been either religious based or Twin Flames, where they. I'm sure you're familiar with Twin Flames, where they mind control. Now, I understand there's a lot of mind control here with what everything he just said to you. Was there anything about alienating you from your family or telling you what you can or cannot eat, wear, go, do, things like that?
Totally. Well, what's I think like kind of unique about this group and why people stay there for so long is like it's very subtle, right? So there's like, if you go live, I don't know, like on a literal compound, right, where it's like we all wear white clothes and eat vegan food. That's like very literal control. And then there's like really subtle control where it's like the language we used was like high vibration and low vibration, or in alignment with yourself or not in alignment. So there's control around things in this very like subtle and slowly built over time sort of way. One of the methods that are used, like that makes people really susceptible to this in this particular group, is like that meditation, that running energy meditation is actually a hypnotic process. So basically, like you walk into class every week and you sit down and everybody does the same meditation together, and it's usually like guided for you. And the instructions at the end of it, like I do hypnotherapy now, like you hypnotize somebody and then you make sure to bring them out of that state because you're in that very suggestible state when you're finished with that process. The instructions here are to not come out of that state. So everybody sits in class the entire time, like basically in a hypnotic trance, like kind of coming in and out of it. So when you're in that space, everything somebody says to you like if there's nuggets of it that even slightly match like things you already sort of believe, those are going to be accepted automatically as truth. So he kind of gets like under your skin in this sense by hypnotizing you at the beginning of the class. You think you're just meditating, and now you're in a suggestible state and everything that comes out. So I remember one time him talking about how like leopard print was a low vibration um, of clothing, right? And so some people would really like take those things seriously, and the way that they dressed would kind of match the things that he deemed were okay. I love leopard print, and I would just wear it just to spite him because that's just
Do
part
you
of
think
me.
that you were almost
But it
hypnotized
was
to stay?
not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, like it's not that type of like like we think of movies with hypnotizing and like really kind of controlling
Right.
somebody like that. Definitely not like that. But it definitely creates that like mindset where all of this stuff gets really absorbed and accepted as like this is the truth of what's happening here. So like I really believed, and like it still comes up to this day where I'm like, oh, if I get sick, it's because I left, right?
Oh,
Like
yep.
if something really bad happens to me, like maybe it's still because of that, and that's like part of that ongoing work, as I'm sure you know. Like
Oh,
it's not all
yes,
just
for
over
sure.
with, done. Because you're never done.
Yeah.
Where were they getting the bulk of their money from? So obviously you have to pay for these courses or these stages of classes. And if you want to tell us how much they were, I'd be curious. But you said there was a compound, and were people living there? I mean, how did he make money?
Oh, there's no compound in this
Oh, okay.
district. Yeah. So classes all functioned out of a like kind of typical like office building, like a business building, which is kind of a weird place for a spiritual school. When I started the school, you paid like $35 a week for class. Now it's 50 a week for class, and classes can range from like 2 people in them to like 16, 20. And so there's multiple classes going on a week. So that's basically where most of the money comes from. It also runs as a nonprofit. So they're organized as a nonprofit church. So obviously, like you have no taxes
No
then.
That's
taxes, right?
unusual. Yeah.
And one of the other like really manipulative practices is that the people like he's not the only teacher, right? There's other people teaching other classes, and there's assistants. And this is where like people's time gets really abused, is that you're told at some point like what would be good for your growth is to assist a class, right? So now you're going to your class and paying for that, and you're going to another class to assist, basically work, and not get paid for that, right? And then the teachers, I think, get paid kind of a minuscule amount, like in comparison for the service that they're giving. So basically, like the overhead there is like renting an office building, which I've heard rumors may not even actually cost anything, and then paying for a staff, which basically doesn't exist. So most of that money goes straight to him, I believe.
Were there books, things that if you come to class, were you handed anything like manuals or?
Yeah. So there were lots of
Oh,
handouts. This is kind of where things get kind of interesting. Was like in my eventual decision to leave, like one of the questions I kept having. So I made it to level like 9.5 or something. And there's only 10 levels. And one of the one of the things that really makes this a like really toxic place is that no feedback was ever allowed, like no criticisms, no questions. If you had a question about where something came from, like you were I don't know if you're familiar with the term like thought stopping cliche or thought stopping techniques, is basically like you have a thought or a question that's like out of alignment with the group think and the group belief. And then you are taught to like meditate, go back into that hypnotic state so that you change the question into something that's like more palatable. So if somebody asks, like, where did this information come from? They would be told, you're asking that question from your third chakra. You have to stop everything you're doing, like change the question entirely, or like find the answer in spirit, which nobody ever really does. So I was like really bothered by this, that like we can't ask questions. Nobody knows where this came from. The rumor is like Dana and Eric downloaded it like psychically. and I started asking ChatGPT questions about some of the concepts that we were talking about. I was like, where did this thing come from?
Good for you.
And it turned out to be like basically all Scientology. So we had like a lot of handouts and things, and like he was kind of a master of like reading a little bit of something, twisting it whatever way he wanted it to be, and then claiming it as his own. So a lot of the terminology, the techniques, everything that we were doing was Scientology that was like slightly tweaked. So there were definitely like handouts and things, like most of which you never had to pay for. When you got into upper levels, there were retreats that you would go to that you would also pay for. So, like in the upper levels, it's like once a month on a Saturday, you had to pay, I think it was like $75 for a retreat. And then in a couple of the levels, you had a retreat at the end that you paid for, which you gladly did because you were so excited to like get to this.
Did you go somewhere on these retreats, like into the mountains or something, or
There were two of them we did. Yeah.
Yeah. Melody, does this sound familiar to you? The borrowing
Oh, yes.
from
yes.
other cults?
My cult leader did that too. I called it the salad bar of cults. Whatever he liked from another group or teaching or religion, he would grab it and throw it into his, and he'd just throw it in the salad bar. It was,
Twin Flames is doing this. They're all doing it. Yeah, they're all like taking from Chinese menu A, B. So
yes.
Whatever suits them, they grab from Scientology. They grab from Jehovah's Witness. They grab from House of Yahweh, or they grab. It's just fat. And then when you just said that, I was like, of course.
Yes, it's almost like
there hasn't been one cult that's been original.
Yeah, it's almost like they get a manual and they share ideas with each other, and there's some cult leader website that we don't know about. I'm not sure, but it seems that way.
Yeah.
It's called Cult Leader Match or something.
So when we got in level 5, like, it's like, oh, you're in this like top secret level now, right? What's the top secret information? And there was more than one class where we talked all about mind control as well. Like, so there was a whole class where we talked about MK Ultra and all of these other cults and mind control and like the secret government projects and like all of this stuff, which like this was like him telling us to our faces what we were doing, right? Or what was happening, and nobody caught on to it. And like looking back, I'm like, oh, like no wonder it's so subtle and kind of sophisticated in this sense. Like this man's been studying this literally for years.
Oh yeah. How many members were there approximately?
Let me try to do some mind math. Like usually there would be an ongoing like level 1, 2, 3, and 4 that were kind of always happening. And then maybe like up to 4 or 5 upper levels happening. So there was always a 10 and then a couple others. So let's say like 8 times 15, whatever that number is, like maybe 100-ish.
Okay.
Maybe more. Once you got to level 10, you could come and go. So in this level 5 through 10 period of time, you're also not allowed to leave. So you can leave at any time, but when you're in the upper levels, now you're actually not allowed to leave, where it would be a big deal if you did choose to leave. And there was like a process for that.
Let's talk about leave where, because the only place was this building where he was holding the classes. You would go home at night.
Yep.
Or wherever you go. And if you, like you said, you went to level 9.5, I guess that's at the point where you finally left. But I don't get this leaving. You're done.
Well, that's like,
where do you go?
Totally, right? Because this is where it's like, this is how mind controlled we are, right? It's like, you're in this class that's once a week. You don't live there. It's not your job, right? There's so many things that are not attaching you to this place. And yet, like, the even idea of like leaving in the middle of a level was like astronomically absurd. And that goes to those like exit costs and that like implanted fear, right? If you left in the middle of a level, those are the people who had all this bad stuff happen to them. Those are the people whose house is burned down or who got cancer. So it would be like they've really pushed that one home. Like we even like signed a contract at the beginning of the level. Like nobody took it, but it was like your contract with yourself that you were agreeing to do this work through the end of the level and then you can leave. I did leave in the middle of my level. Like we had a break and I just never came back. I was like, I'm so done with it.
I'd like to hear about that, but was there at any point in level 1 through 9 that they asked you to recruit? I can't imagine that he wouldn't want you to go out and bring people in. I mean, that's how you grow and expand, is to bring. Were there any recruitment techniques?
This is where it's like, very subtle again, or I think where he gets away with it so well, because there's not those like outright, like it's not obvious by any means. Recruiting, like they never advertised. This was also part of, I think, I wound up spending a lot of money that I did not have, like not giving it to the school necessarily, but to the other like teachers and things, right? Because if like one of the things that I struggled with for a really long time is like making a living out of my business. And it would always kind of like ebb and flow really strongly. And like, it was really hard. And when I would talk to them about this, right, the problem was never like, you just don't know how to run a business, which was actually the problem, right? Like you don't get a business class in acupuncture school that's worth anything. Was never like, you need to go learn how to run a business. It was like, you have a spiritual problem. And the solution to that spiritual problem is doing more spiritual healing, like doing more spiritual work. And you can go see this person and this person and this person and pay them $200 to $500 an hour to go see them. So there was definitely like that piece where like people who are really struggling financially are like putting money towards this thing that's actually not getting you anywhere. And I got way off track. What was the question?
Yeah. My question was about recruiting other people, but you answered that. Go ahead, Melody.
I have a question. How many years did it take you to reach this level 9.5?
So I spent 8 years.
Wow.
So wow. 8 whole years. And there are people who've been in there for 20 plus. There's a long time.
I have to ask, just from sheer curiosity, and you don't have to answer, but how much did you spend in those 9 years?
Oh my gosh. I have not done a total tally on this, but I would say for a good period of time, there was definitely like a $100 to $400 plus a month chunk of money that I was putting towards a lot of this stuff. I went on 2 trips to Brazil with this group, and they had like a sister group. And so when you talk about recruitment and getting new members, that's kind of where that happened. So there's another group called Celebrating Life Ministries, and they're kind of buddies together. And that group's sort of like a non-denominational, like, but religious themed, like healing, whatever. And so they have retreats where people come for the whole weekend, and there's like classes. It's very like large group awareness training kind of style of a thing. And so since the 2 groups are together, like that would be a recruiting environment for the school. One of the things they don't let you do is like take class online. So it's only people who like live in the area who come there. But yeah, definitely.
Okay. I just did some math with the calculator.
Yeah.
So I'm just going with what you said. So if you spent approximately $400 a month, you said $100 to $400, but let's round it out to, let's say about $200 a month.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's 200 times 12 months is 1 year. So in 1 year, you spent $2,400, but you were there 9 years. So
8.
We're upwards of $22,000 or 8 years. Okay. So we're roughly $20,000. Yeah. And that's not including the trips that you went on.
Totally.
Yeah.
Which is
so probably 20 to 30,000, something like that.
Totally.
Wow.
Yeah.
You probably didn't add that up for a reason. You probably didn't really want to know those numbers. It's probably a little cringy.
Sorry, I didn't want to. I just learning about these cults, doing this podcast with Melody, and I'm fascinated. And of course, it always comes back to Twin Flames, because they were the first cult that I investigated, and they're sucking money out of people in droves, like, because they are now multi millionaires, living in this beautiful house in Michigan somewhere, and I think they have several houses now. So I just get angry when they do this to people. They suck the money out of hardworking people, and you don't really walk away with anything. You like twin flames. Nobody's learning anything. Nobody's getting their soulmates, and the ones that are getting their soulmates are either they don't last. They either have to have top surgery because they were the wrong gender. It's just, I mean, you probably know all about it if you haven't watched the documentary or know about it. It's just you spend a lot of money on these cults, and in the end, what do you actually have to show for it?
More problems.
More problems. Yeah. So, wow. I'm sorry, Kim.
I have a question. Do you have any contact with other ex-members? Has anybody else left that you know? So when I was like,
oh yeah.
Okay.
And that was part of my like bolstering myself to leave process. Which like if anyone listening like feels like you're in a group like this, or somebody you like and love is in a group like this, and you're like, I really want to get out, like have them talk to people who've left. That's such a big piece of the puzzle, right? Because the only stories we ever heard are about people who had really bad stuff happen to them when they left. You don't hear about the people who totally thrived and like now live their dream life because they left, right? And so I like found out, you know, it was like the Scientology thing came up, and I was like, well, I need to learn more about Scientology because that's another totally secret thing, right? Like nobody knows what happens there. But a lot of people have written books and memoirs and things about it. I started reading about that. And so not only was it like, oh, the language and the processes and the teachings are all really similar, but everybody's experiences were really similar. I read Jenna Miscavige Hill's book, and she was like a kid in Scientology. I had no idea that there was like a whole compound for the kids there. And she talks about how she like couldn't see her parents basically ever, and how fucked up the compound was, and how she was like, this is wrong and I don't like it. But the way that mind control aspect works, and I think this is true in a lot of groups, is like you think it's your problem. And that was very much part of the rhetoric at FSD, was like, if you had a problem with something or somebody, that was your thing to work out, right? It's not that they need to change.
Yes.
And I'm sure this is how I'm being talked about by talking out about this stuff, is like, oh, that's her problem, right? We don't have to reflect on what we're doing. So you're never asking questions, and you're never like going, oh, like I'm going to say something, because you say, oh, I don't like how this is happening or whatever. I'm not going to ask that question. I'm going to do my own personal work, because me even having that question is me doubting things, or me not trusting things, or me not being spiritual enough. And she talked about having that same experience. And like when her parents came one time, it was like she totally had the opportunity to be like, dude, you guys, this is really bad here. And she didn't say anything because she was like so indoctrinated to believe that that was all her fault. And so like reading those other people's stories, I was like, wow, that's how I feel about this whole thing. And this is obviously like not unique in any way, shape, or form, which we were also really told was like everything here is so special and unique, and you being here is just like this miracle in and of itself, when in fact it absolutely wasn't. So I talked to people when I was leaving who I knew, like people who were in upper levels also. And so there were a couple of people who moved. And so if you moved, you had to leave class, right? Even when the pandemic was in the midst of it and we did have class online, still wouldn't allow people to do it. And so I reached out to people and talked to them. I was like, here's what I think is going on. And they were like, yeah, you're not wrong. And like one of my friends, like one of the rules in this group was like, if you're in an upper level and you want to date another student in the school, like you have to ask permission to do that through a Senate reading. So that group reading of multiple people giving you a psychic reading was like a requirement if you wanted to date somebody. If you wanted to move or change jobs, like not a requirement, but strongly encouraged, right? So that decision making goes way down. You're no longer allowed to make your own decisions. Like you have to default to listening to your spirit guides, and even that's not good enough. You have to listen to everybody else's reading about it instead of being empowered to make your own choices.
Kim, how many years has it been since you've left?
Almost 2.
And as far as you know, they're still going.
Oh yeah.
Do you know if the leader, what was his name? Dan?
Dana.
Dana.
And who was Eric? Was there a co-leader? Were there 2 leaders? Because you mentioned Dana and Eric.
There was kind of like it's like a pyramid, right? It's like Dana at the
Okay.
top, and then he has 2 guys kind of next to him.
Do you know if how his lifestyle was? Like what kind of house he had? I'm curious. Was he
Wealthy?
Oh, super modest, right? Like
really?
not what you would picture was happening.
Okay.
I imagine like he also struggles financially to some degree or another. Like why or
So what's his agenda here? Because Jeff and Shalia, Twin Flames, we know what their agenda is to become millionaires, and they did. And
Well, he might have a lot of money in the bank. Just because somebody lives modest and power, yes.
doesn't mean they don't have money, right?
And it's power, right? Like that's his social. So I read a great book. It's called When the Narcissist Comes to Church. I forget the author. And it's a therapist who works with, like, you have a new pastor you want to put into your church, and he'll come and check him out and make sure he's not a narcissist, or like that's kind of his deal. And so like the narcissistic type person, like they can't really connect with people, but they want to connect with people, but they don't. And one of the things that he said in that book was like in the spiritual context, like we think about like narcissism. One of the theories is like that person is like so overloaded with shame that they can't actually see it. Like you can't actually even look at that piece of yourself. Like it's so overwhelming. And so narcissism sort of develops as a way to like separate yourself from that like piece of yourself you don't want to look at. And in spiritual context, like this is the person who's going to be like, I'm so connected to God or the divine or whatever it is that I don't need to have all of these like earthly things. So I don't have relationships. I don't need to have a real job, or I don't need to have X, Y, and Z in friendships. And that's something that he did a lot, was like, I don't have friends. He was married for a period of time. That relationship ended kind of around when I started going there. So he's very like isolated in a sense. And I was, because I thought about that all the time, like, why, right? He's not making a bunch of money. There's not like these outright things happening, but like this is his social circle. Like, and this is what a great setup for somebody who like needs to be idolized and adored, right? Is like, you've created this thing where everybody thinks he is like God on wheels, right?
Guru,
like,
yeah.
Everything about everything. Any of your interactions, like he completely controls. I have another friend who was, he was more in the sister group, and left that. And like, we talk about stuff often. And he was like, oh, I saw him the other day on the street. And I was like, I want to talk to you. I was like, good luck with that. Because that's a person who's going to manhandle that conversation. But yeah, I think it's power. And I think it's connection in a kind of roundabout way.
Let's talk about your leaving the cult and your transitioning. So, because from, again, the interviews that we have done, we have talked to many people who have spent their childhood, they were born into cults, or their teenage years, and they were in them for 10 years or 15 years, and they finally got out. There was a young lady who around 29 or 30 finally got out of the cult, and she had never gone to a movie theater, So how was your transition out back into the real world? Because you had joined them prior, so you knew what the real world was. You joined this cult, and then you left. How was the transition for you, and where are you today?
So the transition was kind of seamless and awesome, which I wasn't, I was like, who knows what's going to happen. They say there, there's like a few different ways people leave cults, and it's like either the leader dies and the whole thing dissolves, which isn't your choice, right? That like the cult disappears and you can no longer be part of it. You get kicked out, also not your choice. and then like you choose to leave, which is pretty rare. Like that's not usually the way people leave these things. So I was very like ready to roll when I just never came back. And I didn't tell anybody that I was leaving. One of the things that I was struggling with for a long time was like a lot of kind of diffuse, weird physical symptoms, right? And like a lot of like mood swings and all this kind of stuff. Like would cry like almost every day, and like all of this stuff that was coming up, and had the like realization like maybe this is like because this is a toxic environment, right? Like when your body knows what's not safe for you. And so I was like, maybe things will actually get better when I leave, because I'm not purposely putting myself into this toxic environment. My boyfriend, like at the time, or who's still my boyfriend, if you talk to him, he'd be like, oh, it's like talking to somebody who's going to visit their abusive boyfriend. Like the way I would talk about it and feel about it, like he was like, it was really hard like to see you go through all of that. So when I left, I was like, oh, like I don't have to go be like kind of shamed and ridiculed in like this really subtle, weird, diffuse way every week. Like there were like the the expectation or the goal was that you were basically like in this spiritual state 24/7, which is another really problematic thing to do. Like spiritual practices can be super helpful, but there's something that needs to start and end, not be like a 24/7 process, because then you like kind of disassociate a lot. Another friend I still hang out with, who was part of the group, we got together maybe a couple months after I left, and she was like, how's it going? I was like, oh my god, everything is so much better. I feel like I actually like I don't feel like shit anymore. Like I realized that piece about my business where I was like, I don't actually have the skills to do this. Maybe I need to get a coach to do that. I already wasted so much money on spiritual stuff. Like maybe we spend money on something that's actually beneficial. And the way we described it was like feeling like the past 8 years you've been floating over your body watching yourself, like really disassociated and like not really living your life, like having a really hard time making decisions or like participating in things that were fun that you once liked but now are like, oh, is this the right thing to do? Like the constant second guessing.
Good.
Oh,
I want to segue that in. So you said you mentioned your boyfriend.
Mhm.
So while you were in this cult, I almost said organization. I say call it Ace of Spade. Uh, was he ever he was hands off, or did he ever come to you and say, I think you should leave, I think this is harming you, or did he just kind of like let you do your own thing?
He was pretty hands off, yeah. And it, like, I think around the time we got together was when I had my first, like, this isn't what I thought it was moment, which was
Okay.
where there was a retreat with the other group and they, like, didn't follow their own rules. And basically, like, over a third of the group got COVID at that retreat. And then afterwards, the talk about it was like, oh, like, if you look at all of what happened, like one of the main presenters came to the retreat with COVID, didn't test like he was supposed to. And then it was like that inner circle and like a bloom of who got COVID after the event, right? So it was like, it's clearly the guy who had the cough.
Right.
And the talk about it afterwards from all of these leaders was like, oh, we read it, like we psychically read it. And it was because there was a staff member, like one of the janitors that had COVID. Like, you
Oh,
don't
please.
know that. It was like blatant lies, no responsibility, no accountability. And I was like, this is what? uh, so basically, like the beginning of our relationship was also the beginning of me ending my relationship with that group and leaving. What was that, Melody?
oh, I was curious. I wanted to know how you, because you mentioned off mic that you kind of use your doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine and your hypnotherapy to help other ex cult members. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain a little bit about that to us and the audience?
Totally. Yeah. So I was like, obviously, cults are fascinating, right? Like, we have a lot of shows about cults. America has a lot
Yes.
of cults. one of the theories on that is like that we just don't really actually have culture. So we need something to like grab onto. But I did like a coaching certification during the pandemic, right? Because you can't really do acupuncture on Zoom. And I was like, what am I going to do instead? I do a lot of mental health work in my acupuncture practice in general. So that was sort of one of the things I was like, oh, we can kind of, I want to learn more about this. And so I did some more trainings on like, how do we help people who are leaving these situations or in these situations or the families of the people who are in these situations. And since I've been speaking out about this group, like the people who contact me from it are all family members of people who are still in the group. And it's like breaks my heart because it's just people who are concerned and they're, struggling with like, what do I do? And the unfortunate truth is like not a lot, like keep the door open. And so bridging like with my acupuncture practice, which I've been in practice since 2010, it's like almost 15 years now. I also work with a lot of people who've been kind of harmed by health and wellness practitioners or like the health and wellness piece of spirituality, right? Where like the medical medium guy, right? Like he's not a doctor. He has no business telling you what to drink or do. Where people see an herbalist who says, "Oh, you have cancer, like I can cure you." And then they end up with stage 4 cancer. Or you go to a nutritionist who has no training whatsoever because the nutritionist isn't a licensed field,
Right.
and you end up on a elimination diet for 2 years when it should have been 3 months, and now you have an eating disorder because you're afraid to eat anything. So I kind of have bridged where those two things intersect, where like, you're hiring a healthcare practitioner to help you change habits to literally control your behavior in some sense, and where does that line get drawn where it becomes not helpful anymore? And then of course, like my kind of expertise in the cult arena is definitely more new agey, like Scientology, aliens, all of that good stuff.
After listening to your story, it is now 48 minutes into our interview. What do you think it was? And I'm also what you had said something about why America has so many cults, and it's because we don't have any culture. And I want to discuss
Address
that
that.
with you because I have a theory. What do you think it was that drew you to this cult in the beginning?
Oh, I mean, probably a multitude of things, right? So, like where I was in my life, right? Like super struggling with relationships, with my business, like searching for meaning. And that's kind of like one of the like people are like, who ends up joining cults? And it's like, it's not people who are really fucked up. It's people who are like really motivated to change things
Yeah,
and like
or
have some
vulnerable.
for like
Yes.
different points of view or like really want answers, right? Where if you're like, I can't stand not having the answer to this. A lot of the practices matched stuff I had already done before. So when I had gone to that psychic school when I was younger, like it was similar. It was like, okay, this is already something I've done that I had found helpful.
Well,
And like Dana, like his charisma and his certainty were certainly a factor. Where like he's a person who's like, no, this is exactly what you're going through. Like, we'll put words into your brain and into your mouth and tell you exactly how you feel. And you're like, uh-huh. So there was kind of that congealing of things. It's like right timing plus like something that already resonated with me. And plus a person who's really charismatic and really confident and really certain about like how this would help me, right? Like it was like, oh, you're gonna get cancer and have a heart attack, or you could come here, and I like was in that space where that seemed plausible.
okay, I'm going to bring you back to that statement you made that I think you just kind of made it off the cuff. Why America has so many cults, and it's because we don't have culture. Is that just something you blurbed out, or is that something you believe?
I feel like I've heard that before, and I do believe it. I think one of the things that happens like in cults is like, or why we end up in them in the first place, and also like why you might end up in a toxic relationship is like it answers an unanswerable question, right? It gives like meaning. to things. If you're like, what's the point of my life? Like turning to spirituality and religion is like the place we go for that. When we encounter somebody who says, this is definitely the meaning of your life, or this is definitely how you go to heaven, or how you get off the wheel of karma, like that's really soothing to listen to, right? You're like, I have this question that's really important to me. It doesn't have an answer. Like, nobody knows what happens when you die. We can't actually answer that question. This person comes along, they like, whatever they say kind of matches what you might already believe, and we kind of glob onto it. And so, like, in other countries where there's like rich history and culture, like America is new, right? There's not a lot. We're kind of disconnected from it. We're really disconnected from each other, right? There's like that hyper individualism that comes through. That like ability to draw meaning out of stuff, or the like myth and the story and what comes like from that rich culture, like doesn't totally exist here. So we're like ripe for the picking for like a belief system that works for us. And when people are kind of like, we're all little.
I think that holds water for the modern times. I'm 64, so I was born in 1960, and going to school I learned that America was built on immigrants. So the Polish, the Irish, the English, the Italians, those were the main ethnicities that were coming over, the British. And they brought their culture with them. So if you go to Boston, you're going to see a lot of Irish culture. If you go to Wisconsin, you're going to see a lot of German culture. Depends where you are in the United States, but that held true 100 years ago, 50 years ago. I think because of the political climate over the past 20, 30 years, America has lost its way. We have lost our foundation and tradition of bringing we've lost who we are. And so when I was growing up in high school, they would say, what's your background? And I would say, I'm Italian, because that's predominantly what my background is. And, or somebody would, their last name was O'Brien. So yeah, you're an Irish. Now, I think we are so far removed from generations, and there's also the intermingling of generations. You know, different cultures are intermarrying, which is fine. I'm not saying anything against that. That America is now becoming its own culture, but it's lost. So there, I'll agree with you. You have a whole new generation. You got Generation X, Y, Z. You know, millenniums, baby boomers, and each one that comes about is floundering to find its footing, and we're lost. The new generations are just lost. They don't know anything about tradition, anything about the past, and that's okay. Maybe that's so. I think I'm agreeing with you to a certain extent. The new from 2000 on, I think many of these cults are prospering because people are looking to belong to, or like you said, you're looking for something to, you believe in something, so you find, fill a void, or birds of a feather flock together, and all that kind of stuff. So I'd be curious to see the number of, I guess I could artificially intelligent perplexity or something, and find out how many cults that they think there are in America, and how many Americans actually consider them belonging to. Of course, they don't belong to a cult; they belong to a religious organization. But I'd be curious. We should do a little investigation into that. What the actual numbers are. So
yeah, I was just writing it down. I think we'll put it in the outro.
Okay, Kim, phenomenal story, and you came to us with not just the knowledge of being in this cult, but you had a different, unique perspective, because you were not in a cult for 29 years, and then you joined a cult, and you got out of a cult, and that's not what we've been hearing. So, and then of course, along the way, you are a doctor in different fields, Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and hypnotherapy. So you bring that to the table as well. So I can't begin to thank you enough for sharing this story with us. Any parting words or thoughts because our audience are mostly ex-cult members, or people or family members that are either struggling to make sense of this and or trying to get out. We do have some people that might be listening who are trying to get out. Any words of wisdom you would like to leave us?
I mean, there's so many for the people who are like struggling to get out. Like, I don't know. Part of what helped me was to just go, right? It was like to learn about it. And then it's like one of those situations where you kind of just have to jump off the diving board and hope for the best. Like, I think it was Leah Remini's Scientology book also. She was talking about how, like Scientology, like, so a lot of the fears that we had in my group was definitely Scientology based, right? Like, you'll go crazy, like all this stuff will happen, your life will fall apart. And she was like, my life already sucks. Like, why? Is it gonna get any worse? Like, I don't know. Let's find out. So there's some kind of playfulness there of just like, what if we just did it? And of course, like, it's not always the safest thing to do, right? We have to have things in place to like catch us in the meantime if housing or family or whatever is a piece of that. And it's sort of like any toxic relationship I've ever been in, everyone I've ever broken up with, I wish I did it sooner, right?
Right.
And then, like, for the people who are, the loved ones of those people who are stuck in groups like this, it can also be helpful to remember, like, if somebody believes in something that you think is crazy, like, that doesn't make it a cult, right? The belief system in and of itself is just a belief system. It's like how the group is run and how you feel in it, which also means that, like, while I consider the group that I was in a cult and really harmful because it was, some other people don't see it that way and don't experience it that way. So, like, it's a cult to you, it might not be to somebody else. And being a cult is technically legal. Like, there's nothing against that until you start robbing the government of taxes or things like that.
Or hurting innocent children because
totally.
Yeah.
And most of us, when we're in a cult, we don't call it a cult. You don't call it a cult or refer to it as a cult, usually until you're out of it. And that's usually in retrospect, you look back and go, oh my God, that was a cult. So yeah, that's usually
like,
not
happening?
A term you use. Yeah, it's not usually a term you use when you're actively in it.
Totally. And if you are calling it a cult, like, it's probably a cult. Right. If you're in it and you're saying that, it's probably
and then it's time to get out.
And I also liked your advice too about talking to ex-members, advising people that are wondering, hey, is this a cult? And telling people, go talk to an ex-member. And I think that was really good advice because that's where you're going to, I think, have the best chance of waking somebody up that's currently in a group that might be having doubts, is to talk to somebody else who's left and their thinking is more clear and they've gotten away from that brainwashing and they're able to give you that perspective from the inside, but now on the outside, so to speak.
Totally. And you can like Google it too, right? Like,
yes.
That's like one of the things is like, like you're not allowed to read stuff that's not part of the group in a lot of groups, right? Like,
yes.
What happens if you do? What happens if we go Google like this person and the word cult? Like, what comes up when you start looking for those negative reviews, so to speak, and see what you find, like, because there might be stuff there, and that can be really eye-opening to hear it. And I think for me, like, a piece of it was just reading other people's stories. Like, that group is not my group, but the way that person felt was exactly how I felt. And so if your like loved one is in this type of a group, like, we can gently question, right? Like, staging an intervention is probably not going to be helpful. Keeping that door open for them and then like gently questioning, like, what would your life be like if you weren't here? Or if that person told you that we are all going to go do a suicide pact tomorrow, like, what would you do? Like, would you stop listening to them then?
Yeah.
Where's the line here? We can start kind of getting more curious about things and like probing about stuff.
Encourage that critical thinking.
To just start planting. Right.
Okay, Kim, we have to wrap up in a little, I guess they call it shameless promotion. You are going to be appearing on the Anonymous Andrew podcast in the not too distant future. So I'd like to do a little teaser for anybody who might, because I might have followers listening to both podcasts. I hope I do. So there is a relationship that we're going to talk about?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So just for those who are Anonymous Andrew fans, and of course my podcast is about dating and romance and heartbreak and navigating that world, the romantic world. So Kim is going to share with us her story of I think you were in a toxic relationship for a while.
My first cult.
Your first cult.
Well,
There you go.
yes,
And
that's
Melody
funny.
and I talk about it frequently.
Yes, I've told Andrew and I have talked many times about the parallels between being in an abusive relationship. A cult is just like an abusive relationship on a bigger level. There's just more people involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can attest to that because I was a victim of that. I was in a cult of one, so
yes,
a cult of two. Okay, Kim. Anybody have any last parting thoughts before we say goodbye?
I have one light-hearted question.
All right, Kim.
Are you wearing leopard print again, or did you ever stop?
I never stopped.
Oh, you never stopped. I love that. Even better. Even better.
Good for you. Good for you. All right. We will put all of Kim's information, her doctor of Chinese medicine, her license for acupuncture, and her hypnotherapy practice in the show notes. So if anybody wants to reach out, are you practicing outside of California? You can do.
So I have an acupuncture practice in the Bay Area, and then I do coaching hypnotherapy like online.
So, okay, good.
Excellent.
So we can put it in the show notes. Anybody wants to reach out to you.
Yes, thank you.
All right, Kim, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating.
Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Yep. Have a good night. Andrew, we want to thank Kim so much for coming on the show and sharing her experience with us. She had such a unique story, and she's doing really good. I love the fact that she never quit wearing her leopard print, zebra print, animal print clothes. I thought that was kind of funny because I know I asked her about that. But it was, and I'll let you go on about talking about how the uniqueness of this interview.
Yeah, what I liked about this one was, and let me do a little backtracking here. So my podcast, I have a different pool of where I get my guests. I've talked about them sometime. I'll give them a plug. They're called Podmatch, and it's kind of like a dating service, but instead of dates, they match podcasters with guests. It's a paid service, but it's a great service, and I highly recommend it if you're a podcaster or if you're an expert looking to get on. And this is where we got Kim. And so while Cultimatum is not part of Podmatch, Kim's bio was talking about this new age cult she was in. And I like the fact that she talked about that she came forward. She agreed to come on Cultimatum because up until now, we have done some of the mainstream cults like Jehovah's Witness, the Luz del Mundo, what was that one with the Hebrew, the black Hebrew,
the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ.
And we did I think we've had one or two IFBs. So in other words, we've been covering a lot of these religious mainstream ones, and of course, Twin Flames. This cult was something off the beaten path, and it was this guy leased some building in, was it San Francisco? Was it? And
I know it's the Bay Area. Yeah, that sounds right.
Right, the Bay Area. And all he did was start offering classes about this concept he had. And so it's just amazing how anybody could, if you just have enough capital to lease a building, you can start a cult. Yeah.
And you don't even need your own ideas, Andrew. You can just steal everybody else's and put them all together, and
which is what
make a cult salad and sell it.
Which is what we find most of these cults are doing now. They're like taking a Chinese menu, 2 from column A, 2 from column B, and whatever. So, but yes, we want to thank Kim. And the good news is for those who listen to my podcast, Kim has a story about romance and dating. She would like to come on my podcast. So for those who do listen to both podcasts, you will hear Kim come on my podcast. We're working out the details now and scheduling, but she'll be back to tell more of her, not the cults, but her story about some of the horrible trauma in her romantic relationship. So
look for Kim on Anonymous Andrew as well. Yes.
Correct.
So,
yeah.
So we want to thank Kim again, and we want to thank all of you once again for tuning in to Cultimatum. Your support is always appreciated. Please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on platforms such as Apple and Spotify. And don't forget to follow, share, and keep listening to all of our latest episodes.
You can also show your support by joining our Facebook group under the name Cultimatum Podcast.
And you can now also find us on additional social media platforms, including Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok, and YouTube.
If you have a cult or human trafficking experience you'd like to share with us, please feel free to contact us at cultimatumpodcast@gmail.com.
And ex-members of cults looking for additional support can consider joining the Cult Escape and Recovery group on Facebook.
And if you're interested in hearing more from me and maybe possibly Kim, you can find me on my other podcast, Anonymous Andrew, Life and the Choices We Make.
Stay safe, stay informed, and remember, you're not alone.